You're really going to arrest a grieving mother at her own son's funeral? The question cut through the cold afternoon air, and for a moment, even the wind seemed to stop. The cemetery sat on the edge of Columbus, Ohio, beneath a sky heavy with gray clouds and the promise of rain. Rows of black umbrellas dotted the hillside, surrounding a polished mahogany casket resting above freshly turned earth. Dozens of mourners stood in silence, their heads bowed, their faces marked by sorrow. At the center of it all stood Angela Brooks. Her black dress moved gently in the breeze as she stared at the photograph resting beside the casket. Marcus Brooks, 24 years old, a son, a friend, a young man whose life had ended far too soon. Angela's hands trembled slightly as she traced the edge of the folded memorial card she carried. For the past 6 days, she had barely slept. Every room in her house reminded her of Marcus. Every quiet moment felt unbearable. Yet somehow she remained standing. Somehow she kept breathing. The minister cleared his throat and opened his Bible. Family members moved closer together. A little girl, Marcus's niece, reached for Angela's hand. The funeral was finally about to begin. Then the sound shattered everything. Sirens. Not one. Several. Heads turned instantly. Conversation stopped. The minister lowered his eyes in confusion. At the far end of the cemetery road, 3 police vehicles rolled through the gates. Their lights flashed silently against the dark clouds overhead. A ripple of unease moved through the crowd. Angela slowly lifted her head. The vehicles stopped less than 30 feet from the gravesite. Doors opened. Uniformed officers stepped out. Nobody spoke. Nobody seemed to understand why they were there. Officer Ryan Mitchell led the group. Tall, confident, and moving with the certainty of a man who believed he was doing the right thing. His polished badge caught a brief flash of sunlight before disappearing beneath the clouds again. He walked straight toward the mourners without hesitation. Family members exchanged worried glances. Marcus's aunt stepped forward. "Officer, this is a funeral." Ryan never slowed down. "I'm aware." His voice carried across the cemetery. Every eye followed him now. Angela remained motionless beside her son's casket. Her expression did not change. Ryan stopped a few feet away and pulled a folded document from his jacket. The cemetery had become completely silent. Even the distant traffic from the highway seemed to disappear. "Angela Brooks?" he asked. The little girl tightened her grip on Angela's hand. Angela looked at him calmly. "Yes." Ryan unfolded the paper. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us." Gasps spread through the crowd. The minister blinked in disbelief. Several mourners immediately pulled out their phones. One man muttered, "What is happening?" Another shook his head. Angela glanced once toward the casket. Her son's photograph smiled back at her from its silver frame. The sight seemed to steady her. "This is my son's funeral," she said quietly. "I understand," Ryan replied. "But we have instructions to bring you in for questioning." A wave of murmurs swept across the hillside. Questions. Confusion. Judgment. Fear. Angela could feel every pair of eyes on her now. Some sympathetic. Some suspicious. Some already assuming the worst. Yet she did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She simply stood there beneath the darkening sky, a grieving mother surrounded by strangers suddenly wondering who she really was. Then the first raindrop struck the top of the casket. Another landed on Angela's sleeve. And somewhere behind the crowd, a young boy's voice broke the silence. "Leave her alone." The rain grew steadier as mourners shifted uneasily beneath their umbrellas. Nobody moved toward the grave anymore. Nobody listened to the minister. Every eye remained fixed on Angela Brooks. The little girl beside her lowered her head, confused and frightened by the tension she could feel but could not understand. Angela gently squeezed the child's hand before letting it go. Her face remained calm, but deep inside, exhaustion weighed on her like stone. The past week had felt unreal. 7 days earlier, she had been sitting at her kitchen table waiting for Marcus to arrive for dinner. His favorite meal had been warming in the oven. She still remembered checking the clock every few minutes and smiling when she saw his name appear on her phone. She never answered that call. Another voice had been on the line instead. Since that night, time had lost its meaning. Friends came and went. Flowers filled her home. Sympathy cards covered the dining room table. Yet none of it touched the emptiness left behind. Marcus had always been the light in every room he entered. He volunteered at youth centers on weekends. He coached basketball at the community center every summer. He remembered birthdays, called his grandmother every Sunday, and somehow found a way to make strangers feel like family. At 24, he had his entire future ahead of him. Angela often found herself staring at old photographs late into the night. Marcus learning to ride a bicycle. Marcus wearing a graduation gown. Marcus standing beside Lake Erie with a fishing rod in his hand, grinning beneath the summer sun. Every image felt like a conversation interrupted too soon. A gust of wind swept across the cemetery, carrying the scent of wet grass and fresh soil. Angela blinked and returned to the present. Officer Ryan Mitchell still stood before her, holding the folded paperwork. His expression remained firm, almost impatient. Around him, several officers exchanged uncertain glances. Some appeared uncomfortable. Others avoided looking directly at the grieving family. The crowd had grown restless. Whispers moved through the rows of mourners like waves. One woman shook her head in disbelief. Another quietly wiped tears from her eyes. A man near the back crossed his arms and frowned toward the officers. Nobody seemed to understand why this was happening now. Angela slowly looked toward Marcus's casket again. Raindrops gathered along its polished surface, forming tiny rivers that reflected the gray sky above. Her chest tightened. She had spent her entire life teaching people that dignity mattered most when circumstances became difficult. Her father had taught her the same lesson decades earlier. Character was not measured during easy moments. It revealed itself during painful ones. She drew a slow breath and straightened her shoulders. The movement was small, but several. People noticed. There was something unusual about her composure. Most people facing public humiliation would have argued. Some would have shouted. Others might have broken down completely. Angela did none of those things. She simply stood beside her son one final moment and allowed silence to speak for her. Across the cemetery road, another vehicle quietly pulled through the gates. Unlike the police cruisers, it carried no flashing lights. Few people noticed its arrival. Fewer still noticed the man stepping out and watching the scene from a distance. Hidden beneath the brim of a dark raincoat, his eyes settled on Angela with immediate recognition. Then his expression changed. Not fear, not surprise, something closer to concern. Officer Ryan Mitchell glanced toward the growing crowd and felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The attention did not bother him. In fact, it reinforced what he already believed. For nearly 12 years he had worn a badge, and during that time he had learned to trust his instincts. Those instincts were telling him that something about Angela Brooks did not add up. The official report that landed on his desk 2 days earlier had raised questions nobody seemed willing to answer. Marcus Brooks had died under circumstances that investigators still struggled to explain. Certain phone records were missing. Several witness statements contradicted each other. And buried within hundreds of pages of documents was Angela's name appearing again and again. To Ryan, it looked suspicious. To Ryan, bringing her in for questioning was the responsible thing to do. What he never stopped to consider was whether the information itself could be wrong. The rain continued falling across the cemetery, creating a soft hiss against umbrellas and jackets. Ryan folded the paperwork and slipped it back into his pocket. Around him, cameras from local news stations had begun arriving. Reporters stood near the cemetery entrance whispering into microphones while producers adjusted equipment beneath plastic coverings. The story was already spreading. A grieving mother under police scrutiny. The headline practically wrote itself. Ryan noticed several officers looking uncomfortable and immediately straightened his posture. He wanted certainty. He wanted control. Most of all, he wanted the situation resolved before anyone questioned his judgment. Across from him, Angela remained remarkably composed. That calmness irritated him more than he cared to admit. Most people reacted emotionally when confronted in public. Most demanded explanations. Angela simply watched him with quiet eyes that revealed almost nothing. Ryan interpreted her silence as resistance hidden beneath politeness. He had seen it before, or at least he believed he had. Behind Angela stood family members trying to make sense of what was happening. Marcus's grandmother clutched a handkerchief in trembling fingers. His cousins gathered close together beneath a large black umbrella. Friends from the community center exchanged worried looks. The entire funeral had transformed into confusion. Nobody knew what to believe anymore. A television reporter near the entrance spoke quietly into her microphone. Witnesses say officers arrived moments before services were scheduled to begin. Another reporter adjusted an earpiece and glanced toward Angela. Every lens seemed pointed in her direction now. Every whispered conversation centered on her. Yet the person receiving the least attention was Marcus himself. His photograph stood beside the casket, rain collecting along the silver frame. The realization briefly crossed Angela's mind. Even in death, her son was being pushed into the background by someone else's assumptions. A distant roll of thunder echoed across the gray sky. The man in the raincoat who had arrived minutes earlier continued watching from near a row of oak trees. Unlike the reporters, he paid little attention to the officers. His focus never left Angela. He checked his watch. Then he checked it again. Concern deepened across his face. Whatever he expected to happen today, this was clearly not it. Nearby, one of Ryan's younger officers stepped closer. "Sir," he said quietly, "are we sure about this?" Ryan's jaw tightened. The orders came through official channels. The officer nodded but did not look convinced. Neither did several others standing behind him. The uncertainty spread quietly through the group. Above them, rainwater dripped from branches and splashed onto the wet ground below. Then a black sedan turned slowly through the cemetery gates. Unlike the media vehicles, it moved with deliberate purpose. The driver parked near the entrance and remained inside. Moments later, the rear passenger door opened. A man in a dark suit stepped out carrying a leather briefcase. The moment the stranger saw Angela standing beside the casket, he stopped walking. His face lost all color. And for the first time that afternoon, someone looked genuinely alarmed. The stranger with the briefcase began walking faster, his polished shoes splashing through shallow puddles as he crossed the cemetery grounds. Several reporters noticed him immediately. Something about his urgency drew attention. He was not family. He was not clergy. Yet the look on his face suggested he had just witnessed a disaster unfolding in real time. Officer Ryan Mitchell saw him approaching and instinctively stepped forward. "Sir, this is an active investigation area," he said firmly. The man barely acknowledged him. His eyes remained fixed on Angela. For the first time that afternoon, a flicker of emotion crossed her face. Recognition. Small but unmistakable. The man stopped a few feet away and lowered his voice. "Mrs. Brooks." Angela nodded politely. "Mr. Whitaker." The exchange lasted only seconds, but Ryan noticed it immediately. "You know each other?" he asked. Neither answered right away. Rain tapped softly against umbrellas. Camera lenses zoomed closer. Every person present seemed to lean forward at the same moment. Finally, the man turned toward Ryan. "My name is Daniel Whitaker." He reached into his coat and produced a professional identification card. Ryan glanced at it briefly. The title meant little to him at first. "Senior Counsel, Washington, D.C." Ryan looked up again. "What exactly are you doing here?" Daniel exhaled slowly. "I came because I heard about Marcus." His voice softened as he looked toward the casket. "I wanted to pay my respects." Angela lowered her eyes. The grief she had worked so hard to contain returned for a brief moment. Daniel noticed. So did several family members standing nearby. But Ryan remained focused on something else. Questions. Connections. Possibilities. The situation no longer felt as simple as it had an hour ago. "Do you have business with Mrs. Brooks?" Ryan asked. Daniel studied him carefully before answering. "Yes." The single word only deepened the tension. Reporters exchanged glances. Cameras continued recording. Ryan folded his arms. "Then perhaps you can explain why she appears repeatedly in an investigation connected to her son's death." The cemetery seemed to freeze. Even Daniel looked surprised by the statement. Angela remained silent. Her composure never broke. Yet several relatives gasped openly. It was the first time many of them had heard such an accusation spoken aloud. Marcus's grandmother pressed a trembling hand against her chest. A cousin shook his head in disbelief. Daniel looked from Ryan to Angela and back again. "Who authorized this?" he asked quietly. Ryan frowned. "That information is not available." Daniel's expression tightened. Not with anger. With concern. Deep concern. The kind that comes from seeing a mistake become impossible to stop. Across the cemetery, the man in the raincoat continued watching beneath the oak trees. He reached into his pocket and removed a phone. After reading something on the screen, his concern appeared to grow. He typed a short message and immediately sent it. Seconds later, somewhere beyond the cemetery gates, a black SUV turned onto the access road. Nobody inside the funeral noticed. Not yet. Near the grave, the rain began falling harder. Water collected along the polished surface of Marcus's casket. Angela looked at it quietly. Then she stepped forward. Every eye followed her movement. She gently placed her memorial card on top of the casket and rested her fingertips against the wood. For several seconds, she said nothing. The cemetery remained completely silent. Then she turned toward Ryan. Her voice was calm, measured, unshaken. "Officer Mitchell," she said softly, "if you truly believe this is the right place and the right time, then I will cooperate." A murmur swept through the crowd. Ryan nodded, believing he had regained control. What he did not realize was that several people had just arrived who knew exactly who Angela Brooks was, and every one of them looked increasingly alarmed. The rain soaked through jackets and umbrellas as the funeral drifted further away from what it was meant to be. The minister stood quietly beside the grave, unsure whether to continue or step back. Family members gathered closer together. Reporters edged forward. Every camera remained focused on Angela Brooks, yet she seemed completely detached from the noise surrounding her. Her attention never strayed far from Marcus's casket. It was as if the rest of the world had become background static. Officer Ryan Mitchell took a step forward. The uncertainty among his officers was beginning to bother him. The arrival of Daniel Whitaker had complicated matters. The appearance of additional unfamiliar vehicles near the cemetery entrance complicated them even more. He needed to act. He needed to show confidence. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, raising his voice slightly above the sound of the rain, "we need to leave now." Several mourners immediately protested. Marcus's grandmother shook her head. "Please," she whispered, "just let us finish burying my grandson." Others joined in. Some spoke softly. Some spoke with frustration. None understood why the situation could not wait another hour. Ryan kept his expression firm. "The decision has already been made." Angela looked toward the older woman and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. The gesture immediately quieted the family. There was something about Angela's presence that calmed people even during chaos. She glanced once more at the photograph beside the casket. Marcus's smile seemed frozen in time, untouched by the confusion unfolding around him. For a moment her eyes lingered there. Then she nodded slowly. "All right." The response surprised everyone. Even Ryan appeared caught off guard. He had expected resistance, questions, demands. Instead, Angela accepted the situation with quiet dignity. Daniel Whitaker stepped forward immediately. "Mrs. Brooks, perhaps we should make a few calls first." Angela shook her head. "No." Her voice remained gentle. "Not today." Daniel stared at her in disbelief. Whatever concerns he carried had clearly become urgent, but he respected her decision. Nearby, the man in the raincoat lowered his phone and watched silently. The black SUV that had arrived minutes earlier remained parked near the entrance. Its occupants stayed inside, observing. The atmosphere felt strange now. Heavy, like a thunderstorm moments before the first lightning strike. Angela reached into her purse and removed a folded photograph. It showed Marcus standing beside Lake Erie at sunset, holding a fishing rod in one hand and laughing at something outside the frame. She traced the edge of the picture with her thumb. Then she carefully placed it beside the memorial card resting on the casket. Several family members quietly wiped tears from their eyes. The simple gesture felt like a goodbye she had not yet been allowed to finish. Ryan shifted uncomfortably. For the first time all afternoon, a small voice inside him questioned whether this was truly necessary. He ignored it. Procedures existed for a reason. Investigations required action. Delays created problems. Those explanations had sounded convincing earlier. Standing beside a grieving family, they felt less certain. Angela finally turned away from the grave. The movement seemed to drain the remaining warmth from the cemetery. The little girl who had held her hand earlier began crying softly. Angela bent down and embraced her. "Be brave for Grandma," she whispered. The child nodded through tears. Then Angela stood once more and began walking toward the waiting police vehicles. No officer touched her. No one guided her. She walked on her own. The crowd parted silently to let her pass. The only sound was the rain falling across wet grass and marble headstones. Behind her, Marcus's unfinished funeral remained frozen in place. Ahead of her, something far larger than anyone present understood was already beginning to unfold. The drive away from the cemetery felt strangely quiet. Rain streaked across the vehicle windows in long silver lines, blurring the outside world into shapes and shadows. Angela sat in the back seat with her hands folded neatly in her lap. She did not look at the officers. She did not look at the road. Her eyes remained fixed on the small gold watch wrapped around her wrist. Marcus had given it to her 3 years earlier on her birthday. She could still hear his voice teasing her about always being late, still see the smile he wore when she opened the box. The memory arrived without warning and settled heavily in her chest. Outside, traffic moved slowly beneath the gray Ohio sky. Inside, nobody spoke. Officer Ryan Mitchell sat in the front passenger seat reviewing documents on a tablet. At least he pretended to. His attention kept drifting. Something about the afternoon no longer felt right. The image of the unfinished funeral stayed with him. The crying child. The grieving grandmother. The photograph resting on the casket. He told himself again that procedure mattered. Facts mattered. Yet the certainty he carried into the cemetery had begun to crack. 20 minutes later, the convoy arrived at the downtown precinct. News vehicles were already waiting. Reporters stood beneath umbrellas near the entrance, speaking rapidly into cameras. The moment Angela stepped from the vehicle, dozens of lenses turned toward her. Questions filled the air. None received answers. Angela simply walked forward with the same quiet dignity she had carried through the funeral. Inside the building, fluorescent lights reflected off polished floors. Phones rang. Conversations echoed through hallways. Officers moved between desks carrying folders and coffee cups. Yet as Angela entered, something unusual happened. Several employees looked up, then looked again. One woman behind a reception counter frowned, as if trying to remember where she had seen Angela before. A detective emerging from an elevator slowed his pace and stared for several seconds. Recognition hovered just beyond reach. Meanwhile, on the third floor, a records supervisor named Harold Benson opened an electronic case file connected to the investigation. He expected routine paperwork. Instead, the screen displayed a restricted access warning. Harold frowned. He entered additional credentials. The file opened. Seconds later, all color drained from his face. He leaned closer to the monitor. Read the information again. Then a third time. That cannot be right, he whispered. Across the room, another employee noticed his reaction. Everything okay? Harold did not answer immediately. His hand moved toward the phone, then stopped. He looked back at the screen once more. The information remained unchanged. The name, the credentials, the federal classification codes. Every line created a deeper sense of alarm. Downstairs, Angela sat alone in a small interview room. Rain tapped softly against the narrow window. The room contained little more than a table, 4 chairs, and a wall clock whose steady ticking seemed unusually loud. Angela glanced at the clock. Then she closed her eyes. For the first time all day, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. A moment to grieve. A moment to remember her son without cameras, questions, or accusations. She thought about Marcus teaching neighborhood children how to fish. She thought about his laugh. She thought about the empty chair waiting at home. A tear escaped before she quietly wiped it away. At that exact moment, 3 floors above her, Harold Benson finally picked up the phone with shaking hands. Because he had just discovered something that was about to change everything. Harold Benson did not wait for a supervisor. He did not wait for approval. The moment the call connected, his voice came out strained. I need the chief immediately. Within minutes, doors were opening across the precinct. Senior officers gathered around computer screens. Secure databases were checked and rechecked. Every search produced the same result. Every credential matched. Every authorization code was valid. Silence spread through the 3rd floor. One lieutenant removed his glasses and stared at the monitor in disbelief. Another quietly muttered a prayer beneath his breath. Downstairs, Officer Ryan Mitchell was reviewing his notes when his phone began vibrating. He ignored the first call. Then a second came. Then a third. By the 4th, irritation turned into concern. He stepped into the hallway and answered. The voice on the other end spoke for less than 20 seconds. Ryan's expression changed almost. Immediately, the confidence drained from his face. That is impossible, he said. A pause followed. No, there has to be some mistake. Another pause. This time longer. Ryan looked through the glass window of the interview room. Angela sat exactly where he had left her, calm and composed beneath the fluorescent lights. Suddenly the room felt smaller. The phone slipped slightly in his hand. Upstairs, the chief had already arrived. So had representatives from multiple agencies. One black SUV after another pulled into the secured parking area behind the building. Men and women in dark suits moved through the halls with urgency. The atmosphere inside the precinct transformed completely. Conversations stopped when they passed. Doors closed. Orders were given in hushed voices. Nobody wanted reporters to hear what was happening. The problem was no longer a routine investigation. The problem was Angela Brooks. Or more accurately, who Angela Brooks truly was. Daniel Whitaker arrived moments later carrying additional documents. When he entered the command office, several officials immediately stood. He placed a leather folder on the conference table and opened it. Inside were credentials, appointments, federal assignments, and judicial records stretching back more than 2 decades. One official slowly exhaled. Another rubbed his forehead in disbelief. Angela Brooks was not merely a respected attorney. She was not merely a public servant. She was a sitting federal judge with jurisdiction over major interstate corruption cases, financial crime investigations, and government oversight proceedings. More alarming still, several ongoing federal matters connected directly to officials within Ohio. The room became absolutely silent. One question immediately emerged. Who had authorized bringing her in under such circumstances? Nobody seemed eager to answer. Downstairs, Ryan finally entered the interview room. The confidence that had carried him through the cemetery was gone. Rain continued tapping against the narrow window behind Angela. The wall clock ticked softly. She looked up as he entered. For several seconds, neither spoke. Ryan suddenly felt as though every decision he had made that afternoon was standing beside him in judgment. Angela observed him quietly. She noticed the tension in his shoulders, the uncertainty in his eyes. She had seen that look before. It was the look people wore when assumptions collided with facts. Finally, Ryan cleared his throat. Mrs. Brooks. The words sounded different now. More careful. More respectful. Angela folded her hands on the table. Yes, Officer Mitchell. Before Ryan could answer, the door opened again. 3 federal officials entered the room. The moment Angela saw them, she recognized each face. And the moment they saw her sitting there, every one of them looked horrified. The room remained frozen. The 3 federal officials stopped just inside the doorway, their expressions shifting from shock to disbelief. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The ticking wall clock suddenly sounded louder than ever. One of the officials, a silver-haired man named Robert Gaines, took a slow breath before stepping forward. Judge Brooks, he said quietly. The title landed in the room like a thunderclap. Ryan Mitchell felt his stomach drop. Daniel Whitaker, standing behind them, closed his eyes briefly as though the inevitable had finally arrived. Angela looked up from her chair. Her face showed no triumph, no anger, only exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that comes from grief too deep for words. Robert removed his glasses. Judge, we are deeply sorry. The apology hung in the air. Ryan stared at him, then at Angela, then back again. His mind struggled to process what he was hearing. Judge, federal judge, the woman he had removed from her son's funeral, the woman he had questioned, the woman he had treated as a suspect. Suddenly, every decision from the past several hours replayed in painful detail. Upstairs, word spread through the precinct with astonishing speed. Detectives emerged from offices. Administrators abandoned paperwork. Officers gathered around computer screens. The truth was no longer hidden. Angela Brooks was one of the most respected federal judges in the region. Her rulings had shaped major corruption investigations across multiple states. She had spent decades protecting the law. And, while she mourned the loss of her only son, she had been publicly humiliated based on incomplete information and assumptions. Outside the building, reporters sensed that something had changed. Additional government vehicles had arrived. Federal personnel moved through secured entrances. News producers began making frantic phone calls. Rumors spread across social media. Questions multiplied. Inside the interview room, Robert Gaines placed a folder on the table. The information that led to today's actions has already been flagged for review, he said carefully. Several discrepancies have been discovered. Angela listened quietly. Discrepancies? She asked. Robert nodded. Significant ones. Another federal official stepped forward. There are indications that unauthorized information may have been inserted into the investigation. The statement sent a chill through the room. Daniel Whitaker immediately understood the implication. So did Angela. This was no longer merely about a funeral interrupted. Someone had wanted attention focused on her. Someone had wanted her removed from that cemetery. Ryan looked as though the ground had disappeared beneath him. "I followed the file that was assigned to me," he said quietly. Nobody responded, because everyone already knew that following a file was not the same as questioning it. Angela studied him for several seconds. The room waited. Federal officials waited. Even Daniel remained silent. Finally, Angela spoke. "Officer Mitchell." Ryan met her eyes. "Yes, ma'am." It was the first time he had addressed her that way. "Tell me honestly." Her voice remained calm. "Did you ever stop to ask whether that funeral was the right place for this?" Ryan lowered his head. The answer was obvious. Across the precinct, supervisors were already launching internal reviews. Emergency meetings had begun. Careers suddenly hung in the balance. Yet Angela seemed uninterested in revenge. Her thoughts remained elsewhere. On a rain-soaked cemetery. On an unfinished service. On a young man whose casket still waited beside an open grave. Marcus Brooks had become an afterthought in a story that should have belonged to him. Angela looked toward the rain-covered window. Then she stood. Every person in the room immediately stepped aside. And for the first time since leaving the cemetery, there was only one thing she wanted: to go back and say goodbye to her son. By the time Angela returned to the cemetery, the rain had finally begun to fade. The heavy clouds that had covered the afternoon were breaking apart, revealing thin bands of golden light near the horizon. Most of the reporters were gone. Most of the police vehicles had disappeared. The noise, the confusion, and the spectacle that had stolen the day had slowly drifted away. What remained was what should have been there from the beginning. Family. Memory. Goodbye. As Angela stepped onto the wet grass, she saw familiar faces waiting near the gravesite. Marcus's grandmother sat quietly beneath a large oak tree. His cousins stood together holding flowers. Friends from the community center had returned despite the weather. Nobody rushed toward her. Nobody asked questions. They simply welcomed her back with gentle smiles and understanding eyes. The minister walked forward and removed his hat. "We waited," he said softly. Angela nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Her eyes moved to the casket. It still rested exactly where she had left it. The memorial card remained on top. So did the photograph of Marcus beside Lake Erie. Water droplets shimmered along the silver frame like tiny diamonds in the fading sunlight. Angela approached slowly. Every step felt lighter than the last. Not because her grief had disappeared. It had not. Grief like this never vanished. But because the burden of humiliation, confusion, and accusation had finally been lifted away. She stood beside the casket and rested her hand against the polished wood. The warmth of the evening sun touched her face. Around her, the cemetery had become peaceful once more. A gentle breeze moved through the trees overhead. Birds began returning to branches that had been empty during the storm. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then the minister opened his Bible and resumed the service exactly where it had been interrupted. This time there were no sirens, no cameras, no distractions, only love and remembrance. As family members shared stories, quiet laughter occasionally mixed with tears. They spoke about Marcus teaching neighborhood children to fish. They spoke about his habit of calling relatives on birthdays before anyone else remembered. They spoke about the way he could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with new friends. Each memory painted a picture of the young man they had lost and the lives he had touched. Angela listened carefully to every word. Each story felt like another piece of her son returning home. As the sun dipped lower, the service came to an end. One by one, family members placed flowers beside the grave. Finally, Angela stepped forward alone. She held a single white rose in her hand. The cemetery became silent once again. She looked down at Marcus's photograph and smiled through tears. "You made this world brighter than you ever knew," she whispered. Then she gently laid the rose beside the casket. No cameras recorded the moment. No headlines captured it. No public apology could equal its meaning. The evening light stretched across the cemetery, bathing everything in gold. Angela stood quietly for a long time, her hand resting over her heart. Around her, family gathered close. Above her, the clouds continued to part. And in the stillness that followed, there was no anger, no revenge, no triumph. Only a mother, a son, and the quiet dignity of a farewell finally completed.